It troubles me especially that she is trying to run as a blank slate, even though she has, in fact, a real record. And it's a record that, from her time as Attorney General to her time as the most left-wing person in the United States Senate, it's a record that would really trouble Americans if they knew anything about it. And of course, the media is doing very little to get that record out and before the public. So instead, Harris has repudiated a lot of her past views. She claims that she no longer wants to ban fracking, for example, which would be a fatal position for her to hold in states like Pennsylvania. She is, very mercenary and very willing to completely just rewrite history, almost in an Orwellian way, when it comes to her own record, because she wants to run as a feel-good candidate, as opposed to a candidate who actually has any kind of substance, track record, or policy positions that would set off alarm bells with the American public. And what this means is that, a lot of voters are willing to, give her a chance. They don't like Donald Trump's personality. They think maybe that Kamala Harris is just a nicer person. But they're going to be really surprised by what they get if they elect her, because it's going to be, again, everything that has been terrible about the Biden administration. And it's going to be even worse because she will be more energetic about pursuing those issues. She is, in a way, kind of the representative of all that's worst in the Democratic Party, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic policy, and then her personal ethics when it comes to things like, instances of having withheld evidence from people that she's prosecuting. And then, look at her endorsement and support for the lawfare that's being waged against Donald Trump. Well, that lawfare, Donald Trump is only a test case. That's going to be something that's going to be used against other politicians, and then ultimately against other businessmen, ultimately against normal, ordinary Americans who, fall afoul of the regime and of the Democratic Party. So she's an extremely dangerous candidate, but she's trying very hard to make herself seem innocuous and seem as if, she has no history of being such an awful person.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Okay, welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 214. I'm talking with Daniel McCarthy, who is the editor of the Modern Age Journal. He's also a columnist for Spectator World and has been around other places. I've heard him on the Tom Woods show quite a few times, so I figured I should bring him on here to talk about the upcoming American presidential election, which is about 2 months away. How are you, Daniel?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Okay, first of all, Daniel, how did you get to where you are today?
Well, I was a supporter of Pat Buchanan back in the 1990s when I was even going all the way back to high school. And so I've always been interested in the critical view that Pat Buchanan had of our U.S. foreign policy, especially things like the Gulf War and later on the Iraq War under George W. Bush. I also was very critical from an early stage of mass immigration and of, the general kinds of policies that were being pursued by the bipartisan establishment, both Bill Clinton Democrats and George H.W. Bush Republicans in the 1990s. And I was also socially conservative, so I was with Buchanan on that too. In the later 1990s, I came to realize that in fact, Ron Paul also was very solid on all of these issues. So I was very keen on Ron Paul as well, and I thought Ron Paul's economic approach made a great deal of sense as well. Pat Buchanan, generally didn't have a systematic view of economics. He's identified with protectionism, but in fact, beyond that, he was not really someone who primarily thought in economic terms. Whereas Ron Paul, of course, is a gateway to the entire Austrian tradition of economics. So in the 2000s, in 2008, I worked for the Ron Paul presidential campaign as he was running for the Republican nomination against John McCain. So that's kind of my political background, at least in terms of how I became interested in some of the issues and themes that would later become prominent when Donald Trump ran for office and then won the presidency in 2016.
And I was 19 when that first Gulf War started. I suppose you were really close to prime military age as well?
I was pretty young. I was about 13 years old, so a few years off.
Oh, wow.
But in fact, there were, high school teachers I had who remembered the Vietnam era and who kind of expected that the Gulf War might go on as long as the Vietnam War had. So it was not out of the question that persons of my age, might, wind up being drafted at some point. But that was not the primary concern. What I really remember about the first Gulf War is the sheer propaganda barrage. And at the age of 13, I didn't have any kind of sophisticated views on this. I just remember thinking, why are we tying yellow ribbons to trees, like, all over the place? What is this meant to achieve? Why aren't we actually talking about anything of real substance here?
I think the first Gulf War was huge because I think there was a chance that we might, some people thought there was a chance we might actually go back to being a non-interventionist constitutional republic. I mean, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and of course, none of us thought we would be fighting communists now either. That's another thing that's completely changed. But so yeah, if you were a betting man, who would you bet on right now for who would be elected president in 2 months?
Well, I think better analysts than myself say that it's a 50-50 race, and I think that's pretty much true. If you had to bet based on the data that's available right now, Kamala Harris would be the slightly better bet than Donald Trump, based on the fact that she's slightly ahead in the polls. It's true that the polls undercounted Donald Trump's support both in 2016 and in 2020, which means that he still has very much a fighting chance. It does worry me that there are a lot of battleground states in play right now. So it seems as if Donald Trump has not succeeded in completely firming up his support in places like North Carolina or in Georgia, or in Arizona for that matter. So states that should be a little bit red-leaning or Republican-leaning are still in play. And the blue states that Donald Trump can expect to break through in or would hope to break through in, which are places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, of those three, only Pennsylvania really seems very competitive, although I think he still has a shot in those others. But the polling in places like Michigan looks rather worse than it does for Trump in places like Pennsylvania. So I think there's a slight advantage for Kamala Harris right now.
Yeah. So what do you think Trump needs to do to win at this point?
He certainly needs to be out in the field constantly and have the kind of presence that he had in 2016 in terms of doing rallies and actually showing up in places where other politicians have just written off and have not actually bothered to go in person to ask voters for their support. One of the things that Trump did in 2016 that allowed him to beat Hillary Clinton, despite all the media advantage that Clinton enjoyed, despite all the money that Clinton enjoyed, she didn't connect with voters. She didn't connect with the public. Donald Trump went to places where, again, no politician from either party had bothered to campaign for 20 years or more, and as a result, he wound up winning segments of the vote in states that had been considered the blue wall, that had been considered to be a virtually unbreachable defense for the Democrats, and which in fact had been unbreachable for Republicans going back for the past 20 years or so. Republicans, for example, constantly tried to win Pennsylvania and constantly fell short. Well, Trump went and he actually campaigned in person and was able to generate enough enthusiasm for his candidacy in 2016 that he wound up winning states like that and then winning the White House. He's got to be just as energetic today, which is hard because he's 8 years older. Nevertheless, and I think not only is he 8 years older, but also he's become a little bit, I don't want to say complacent exactly, but he doesn't have the same sort of entrepreneurial process of discovery going on that he did in 2016. In 2016, I think it was all fun. It was all new. It was something being explored for the first time. In 2024, he feels a little bit like that he knows how to do campaigning. And in fact, he kind of needs more of that naive energy that he had in 2016. So he needs to get out there and, actually meet voters, hold these rallies, create this kind of groundswell of buzz for his campaign. And then on the issues, he needs to focus on, bread and butter, focus on the fact that Kamala Harris is incompetent, that she's tied to the Biden administration. If you don't like Bidenomics, if you don't like Biden's record on foreign policy, then Kamala Harris is going to give you more of the same, only with a younger president who's actually going to make things worse because she's going to do even more of the same kinds of things that have failed with Biden.
Of all the things that are disqualifiers for me, and there are plenty of things, I don't know how anybody can ignore the cases of withholding evidence to keep innocent people in jail and prosecutorial misconduct. That statement by Tulsi Gabbard, where she was withholding evidence. Maybe she was attorney general, but I'm just thinking, how can any American possibly vote for this woman?
Yeah, she is. It troubles me especially that she is trying to run as a blank slate, even though she has, in fact, a real record. And it's a record that, from her time as Attorney General to her time as the most left wing person in the United States Senate, it's a record that would really trouble Americans if they knew anything about it. And of course, the media is doing very little to get that record out before the public. So instead, Harris has repudiated a lot of her past views. She claims that she no longer wants to ban fracking, for example, which would be a fatal position for her to hold in states like Pennsylvania. She is, very uh, mercenary and very willing to completely just rewrite history, almost in an Orwellian way, when it comes to her own record, because she wants to run as a feel-good candidate, as opposed to a candidate who actually has any kind of substance, track record, or policy positions that would set off alarm bells with the American public. And what this means is that, a lot of voters are willing to, give her a chance. They don't like Donald Trump's personality. They think maybe that Kamala Harris is just a nicer person. But they're going to be really surprised by what they get if they elect her, because it's going to be, again, everything that has been terrible about the Biden administration. And it's going to be even worse because she will be more energetic about pursuing those issues. She is, in a way, kind of the representative of all that's worst in the Democratic Party, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic policy, and then her personal ethics when it comes to things like, instances of having withheld evidence from people that she's prosecuting. And then, look at her endorsement and support for the lawfare that's being waged against Donald Trump. Well, that lawfare, Donald Trump is only a test case. That's going to be something that's going to be used against other politicians, and then ultimately against other businessmen, ultimately against normal, ordinary Americans who, fall afoul of the regime and of the Democratic Party. So she's an extremely dangerous candidate, but she's trying very hard to make herself seem innocuous and seem as if, she has no history of being such an awful person.
Yeah, I agree. The lawfare against Trump, and it just I don't know how we got to this point. It's not my phrase, but we've become a banana republic with air conditioning. It's also, I don't know if you've heard what Latinos who oppose Harris call her. They call her Kamala.
No, I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, which is apparently how bad or how awful. It's yeah. So I'm going to refer to her from now on as Kamala. So yeah, but anyway, yeah, and Walz doesn't really look much better than this woman.
No, that's true. Walz is a serial liar. He's lied about his military record. He's lied about his wife's infertility treatments. He's kind of politically sociopathic. I mean, this is the guy who went out and created this whole weird meme, and a bunch of lies about JD Vance. He's really someone who is willing to lie, resort to emotional manipulation and appeals at every moment. You can even look at this, this interview that he and Kamala Harris did about a week ago. And, there too, he was constantly trying to be emotionally manipulative. He was dodging the questions about his untruthfulness, about his military record, and about his wife's fertility treatment. He's a really, dishonest, habitually mendacious individual who, wants to try to use emotional blackmail and, extortion on his opponents, on his, potential supporters. And I think the American people find, that once Walz gets out on the field and they see him, in person, they see him campaigning, they realize this guy is really kind of nasty. He's a remarkably repugnant political figure. And I think you're starting to see that, in fact, the Kamala Harris camp, they're finding out that, Walz, on paper, you might just see a photograph of him and you might hear his bio and you might think, okay, this is going to be a Midwestern governor. He's going to be someone who's kind of avuncular, who, kind of seems like a reassuring presence. If you don't trust Kamala Harris, then you've got Tim Walz. Just, how bad could a, Midwest nice kind of guy be? And in fact, Walz is, it's kind of perverse. Walz actually made Kamala Harris look a lot more sincere and normal in this interview that he and Kamala Harris did on CNN, because Walz is such a liar that, Kamala Harris almost glides by in terms of her prevarications, simply because she's not as bad as Tim Walz. So it's almost, in a way, instead of Walz being the nice guy, he's almost instead the contrast, the bad cop that's meant to try to make Kamala Harris look better.
When they picked Walz, I naturally thought of that guy from Minnesota who ran 40 years ago, and of course that ended up being a complete disaster for the blue team. But
yeah,
yeah, but it said, yeah, this is Mondale Ferraro again, but the roles are reversed. And boy, she was unlikable too. But it's it seems like though he's trying to be this almost this Homer Simpson type, but it doesn't really work for him. And I think you pointed out too, that Minnesota is not really at play here. It's pretty much going to go blue, and Minnesota has went blue, since every year since 1972.
That's true, and of course, being Mondale's home state, it's the one blue state in that 1984 election where the Democrats were otherwise completely wiped out. Now, it does seem to me that there is a slim chance actually that Minnesota will be in play. I saw some polls recently that had the Trump-Vance ticket down by only about 5 points there. It's interesting because not only is it a repetition, but with the roles reversed with respect to Mondale and Ferraro, but it's also an attempt at replaying the Democratic hand from 2016, where they had Hillary Clinton. They knew that Clinton would turn off certain rural Democrats even, let alone rural voters who were not strongly aligned with the Democratic Party. And so they thought, well, we're going to put Tim Kaine from Virginia, who has a track record of being a Democrat who can appeal to more rural, especially white voters in places like Virginia. We're going to put him on the ticket with Hillary Clinton, and that's going to balance it out. But in fact, in 2016, the Clinton and the Democratic ticket only had about a 5-point lead over the Republican ticket in the final outcome in 2016. So Tim Kaine was not actually such a great boost to the ticket after all back then, and I suspect Tim Walz is not going to be such a big boost to the Democratic ticket this year. These two Tims wind up both rather falling short.
Yeah, maybe so. It's almost, Dan, I don't like saying this, but it's almost like they're trying to put on a man who almost comes off as a loser, because you can't deny the blue team absolutely positively hates white males. I mean, they might as well just. I don't know what the numbers are going to be, but it's and the political left does completely anymore, and I don't know. So that's a demographic that I think Trump should probably appeal to. But what can you say about Vance? Because you probably heard the cliche: some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some are born in Ohio, which is why we ended up with so many presidential nominees from Ohio. But yeah, so. But what can you say about Vance versus Trump?
I think I'm not totally surprised by all the attacks on Vance once he got the vice presidential nomination. Democrats see Vance as being a threat not only here in the present but also for the future. So they've been working very hard to make him as much of a as radioactive as possible and as much of a target as possible. Vance has his detractors in the Republican Party itself as well, especially among sort of more old guard, neocon types, especially in foreign policy. And Vance, is a young guy. He's, barely 40 years old, and has occasionally said things, actually more than occasionally, in the early part of his career as he was first running for the Senate, which have come back to haunt him. So he's got a lot of, statements which, might have made sense in the context of the campaign he was running for the nomination for the Republican Party in Ohio, first of all, and then in the general election in Ohio. Today, these things are being dredged up and are being used against him. All of that said, I think Vance is still a very good pick for Trump in two ways. First of all, Vance is someone who is able to articulate the Trump agenda much more thoroughly than Trump himself often does. Vance is also someone who was able to connect with blue-collar voters in the state of Ohio, and I think he'll be able to do so potentially in Pennsylvania and in other battleground states as well. And Vance also has, he's a kind of insurance policy for Trump, as a number of people have pointed out. If the Democrats or if, sort of Mitt Romney-style Republicans want to impeach Trump, should he get elected a second time, if they want to impeach him a third time, a fourth time, or however many attempts they'd like to make, they're going to have to think to themselves, well, would we like to get rid of Donald Trump as president only to have him replaced by JD Vance, who's going to pursue very similar policies, but do so perhaps in a more systematic and forceful way? So I think Vance is a good pick. And the fact that, he's faced some headwinds and a lot of criticism from the media, that doesn't surprise me. That was going to be inevitable. Whoever Donald Trump picked was going to be demonized in the ways that Vance has been demonized.
Yeah, and it sounds like Vance has faced a lot of headwinds, period. He, which I think is what a lot of people, here's a guy who didn't have the easiest upbringing, but raised himself up and got to where he is now. It also seems like Peter Thiel is a common denominator with a lot of these people nowadays. What do you think Thiel's up to?
Well, among other things, people often try to think of Peter Thiel in terms of ideology. They should really think about Peter Thiel in terms of talent. This is a guy who has been very successful in business because he is such a great spotter of talented individuals. And he's built, tremendous teams around him, not just the team that has gone on to, political involvement, people like JD Vance, but in so many fields, you've had people, that Peter Thiel has identified who were capable of being successful in business, who may go on to great things in other fields as well. And Thiel is also very interested, he's not a narrow ideologue. He's someone who's very interested in theology, which perhaps people wouldn't have guessed, as well as in economics, as well as in politics. So I think the attempt to demonize Thiel as some sort of puppet master is just the usual sort of left-wing conspiracy mongering, where they see someone rich and successful, they really hate him for those reasons, and then they want to say that someone who's rich and successful must have a special leverage over the political system. Now Vance, because he is someone who has succeeded against all the adversity that he faced as a young person, he is self-made to a very considerable extent. He's not someone who is a charity case for Peter Thiel. On the contrary, Peter Thiel recognized Vance as being someone who was very capable, and therefore, it was a mutual trade. So I think Vance is in no sense, a tool or a mere protege of someone like Peter Thiel. Instead, I think Vance is someone who may be a friend of Peter Thiel, someone who may be grateful for, the ways in which they worked together in the past, but who nonetheless is quite independent. And that's certainly true of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, owes nobody anything, and therefore, he's able to act on the basis of his own instincts and what he thinks is right, rather than on the basis of the kind of limp consensus that is imposed on establishment politicians, even if they are Republicans, and certainly if they are Democrats. It's such a relief and a breath of fresh air to get away from an era when the Republican Party was constantly nominating Bushes and McCains and Romneys. Now at least you have some degree of choice at the ballot box between the two parties. Donald Trump does, you can tell because of all the, attacks on Trump and on Vance, that ticket actually does represent at least a certain degree of change relative to what the establishment in both parties is trying to give us. And it's also very revealing that, of course, now the Cheney clan, represented by Liz Cheney, is endorsing Kamala Harris. That's perfect. I think it's absolutely appropriate that all the neocons, all of the people who want, the kind of unlimited centralized power that the Cheneys and the Harrises both want, they should all be on one party, all on one side. That way, someone can oppose them all together, whether it's supporting Trump or, any kind of effort that's going to say, we reject what both, the Kamala Harris Democrats and the Liz Cheney ex-Republicans jointly stand for. I think it's good to have all the bad people to one side, so you can recognize that, in fact, those, phony Republicans like Liz Cheney and Democrats like Kamala Harris, they have a heck of a lot in common, and they always did, which is one reason why, when people look back at the George W. Bush era, they should say, wait a minute, why is it that so many people from the George W. Bush years wound up becoming not just never Trumpers, but basically, opponents of conservatives, opponents of, the things that they claim that they stood for themselves back during the George W. Bush years. And it's because they never really stood for those things. In fact, they were always playing a kind of more insider influence-based game.
Well, it was always about promoting, wars in the Persian Gulf, and that's one thing that worries me now. I think no matter who gets into the presidency, I think we're going to see an escalation in the Middle East. What do you think is going to happen with that?
Yeah, it's I share your concern, and a lot of that is out of our hands, considering that the Israelis, the Iranians. There's any number of forces in the Middle East which may decide that they have to play a sort of bigger game than they're already involved in. And if that's the case, then there's going to be a lot of Americans who want to get us involved in that. I think it's less likely that we get involved if Donald Trump is president, not because Donald Trump, doesn't have strong support for Israel, but rather because Donald Trump actually does have some degree of awareness that the establishment approach to wars in the Middle East in the past 20 years, and for that matter, probably the past 30 years, have been completely, disastrous and a failure. And I think Trump doesn't want to get sucked into the same kinds of, swamps that consumed, previous Republican administrations. So I have a little bit of hope there, but I think you're right. There is a situation which continues to, not just smolder, but to be a raging conflagration. And the risks of continual escalation there are very high. And of course, everything there is very unstable. So, it's hard to know how long Netanyahu will be able to hold on to power. He had a great many, sort of opponents taking to the streets before the, October 7 atrocities. And there's still a huge amount of opposition that's trying to get rid of Netanyahu. So it's going to be, a nightmare one way or another. But I think if Kamala Harris gets in, you're going to continue to see massive ineptitude, along with this tendency for the Harris administration to want to kind of make a name for itself as not being a McGovernite kind of a Democratic administration, but rather a tough Democratic administration, and that I think is going to set her up to get more involved than someone like Donald Trump would be.
So, what kind of dirty tricks do you think the blue team might try to pull here? But between now and the election, I'm hearing Trump might go to jail. There's all because of all this ridiculous lawfare. I mean,
yeah, that's one possibility. And of course, the thing about the lawfare is that it's politically backfired on the Democrats up to now. So they kept escalating. They kept, adding to the number of indictments, and they kept, thinking, okay, this is going to knock Donald Trump out of the presidential race. And in fact, what it did is it rallied Donald Trump's base, consolidated it behind him. And there's a chance that if they continue to try this, that it may, in fact, continue to backfire. And that voters may say, wait a minute, this is totally unfair. We are the ones who are meant to be deciding who's going to be president in November. And instead, here you have Democratic judges trying to, impose a decision on us by sending Donald Trump to jail, or by, trying to prosecute him and make him a discredited figure. So the Democrats could try that nonetheless. They could try lawfare. They could try to imprison Trump. I think if Harris were significantly behind in the polls, the other thing they might do is completely throw Joe Biden overboard, have him resign from the White House, before the election, have Kamala Harris step in as vice president, immediately become president, and then they could say, okay, well, you don't want to go through, multiple presidents within the course of just, a couple of months. Therefore, you have to elect Harris. You have to keep her in the White House because, she's already there now that Biden has resigned. It's interesting that they've been reluctant to do that, and that Biden has been able to hold on as president, even though he's not capable of being a presidential candidate. So it's kind of baffling how he can be capable of serving as actual president, which is a much more demanding job than just running for president. So it seems to me that they've done this. They've kept Biden around because they don't want Kamala Harris to be that visible. They don't want her to have that much responsibility, because that, again, would force her to be identified with a track record that the Biden-Harris administration has established. It would also force her to, be enough of a public figure that she would have to do more. She would face more press scrutiny. She would face more public attention. And the more that the public sees of her, the less they would like her. Whereas, by keeping her as a candidate and not as president, they're able to, control the image and manipulate the image rather better than they could if she were president. Now, other kinds of dirty tricks, I don't know. But you can never rule anything out. So it's certainly something where, you not only have to win an election, but you have to win an election by as big a margin as possible in order to counteract any kinds of surprises or shenanigans that the other side might have in store.
Do you think there's a possibility that either side comes out of this with a convincing win? I don't think there is, but
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the last two elections in 2016 and 2020 would suggest that this one's going to be very close as well. That said, sometimes you just have a kind of domino effect, And it may be that undecided voters at the last minute all decide to go to one candidate or the other. And if that's the case, then you might actually have, somebody sweep the battleground states, for example, or win a couple of states that are not conceived of right now as being battlegrounds. So it could, I think in such an unpredictable circumstance, maybe Trump is going to be the more likely to surprise us. So it could be that if the polls really are significantly underestimating Trump's support, then it may be that Trump actually does have some of the degree of support, maybe not quite as much, but almost as much as he seemed to have against Joe Biden. So you remember before Joe Biden drops out of the presidential race, people were saying, well, this could be a Trump landslide. And the conventional wisdom is that by replacing Biden with Harris, the possibility of that landslide has been completely negated. But maybe that's not true. Maybe actually there still is, a significant pool of undecided voters who are currently, registering in the polls as not aligned with one candidate or the other. But come the election, they're going to tilt to Trump. You might also have, supposedly shy Trump voters who don't tell pollsters that they're voting for him. So there are, some, grounds for thinking that perhaps you could get more of a Trump groundswell than is expected. That said, that's all kind of speculation. And the data that's actually available is the data of the past two elections, which were very close, and then the data of the polls, which are very close right now, all of which suggests that, yeah, it's going to be an election that, whoever is losing is going to contest it, and is going to say, some nefarious Russian interference or, kinds of other excuses have come into play that have caused the election to go the way they didn't want to go.
Let's say Trump wins, and he only has one term. What happens to the red team after that?
Well, that's where I think the selection of JD Vance is very important, because he continues to put the Republican Party on a foreign policy trajectory of more realism and restraint. So I think that part of the party is going to have a strong champion. If Donald Trump gets elected, then Vance would be, the presumptive frontrunner for the 2028 Republican nomination. And, he would keep that part of the Trump agenda going forward. Similarly, I think that, Vance would continue to appeal to working class, middle class Americans, which would be very helpful. Now, there is this issue where, you can see why in rejecting the Republican establishment as it was represented by Mitt Romney and others, that a lot of Republicans have said, well, we need to throw overboard what had previously been the Republican Party's free market agenda. But that's an overreaction. And when Trump and Vance do that, there are things they can do that might be helpful for the middle class. I think there is, good arguments to be made in favor of certain amounts of protectionism, especially, to fight against the trade warfare that's waged by the People's Republic of China. But if Republicans think that they can continue to win office by trying to compete with the Democrats as the party of bigger government, they're going to lose. And in fact, you saw a great illustration of that earlier this political season, where Vance came out and said, okay, we're going to have a $5,000 tax credit for families. And, okay, that sounds like, something, if it's a real tax credit, if it's, if actual taxpayers are, getting money that's taken out of their taxes, it's, the problem with these so-called tax credits is that they wind up actually being a kind of backdoor to creating new forms of welfare, where you're actually giving people credits for taxes they haven't paid, and you're giving them money basically coming from other taxpayers. Well, Vance, came out with a $5,000 tax credit. The Democrats the next day came out with a $6,000 tax credit. So the Republicans are always going to lose if that's the game they're playing, where they're trying to spend more of other people's money than the Democrats are willing to spend, because there is no limit to the amount that the Democrats are willing to spend of other people's money. Instead, the Republicans have to find a way to be pro-working class, pro-middle class, while still also, having some of the truths that Ronald Reagan, was able to discover, in terms of economic rationality, economic sensibility back in the 1980s. And a lot of ideologues don't understand this. They have not thought about economics per se. They just think about, sociology. They think about politics. They think about religion, but they don't think about economic realities. And so they want to pretend that those realities can be evaded, in the same way that the neocons thought that the realities of foreign cultures and foreign, nations' own politics and setups, that those could also be evaded. Well, they can't. Reality will ultimately come home to bite you. And Republicans need to keep that in mind as they think about, creating some kind of new agenda for the post-Trump era.
where do you think, say, Ron DeSantis or Vivek Ramaswamy or Kristi Noem will be in 4 years from now? I like to bring up Kristi Noem just because she kept South Dakota open, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think Kristi Noem was not going to be much of a contender for either the Republican vice presidential slot or, people had thought perhaps she would even be a presidential contender this year. Neither of those things panned out. I think she probably is not going to be a presidential contender in the future either. But she may be someone who, ultimately winds up in the U.S. Senate or that has a political future of other kinds of, other kinds of paths open to her beside the presidency. Ron DeSantis, I think, has a very strong record in Florida, and he has a future. If the Trump-Vance ticket is unsuccessful this time, DeSantis, I'm sure, will run again in 2028 and will be a very, serious, credible candidate. Even if you wind up with a Trump-Vance win this year, I think DeSantis could be a powerful pick for the Republicans. Perhaps as Vance's running mate in 2028. So DeSantis still has very much a political future. I do think that he was mistaken to run for the Republican nomination this year. I think he wound up, kind of expending all of his political capital that he had built up after his, smashing success running for re-election the year before in Florida. And as a result, coming out of that re-election campaign, he looked kind of invincible. He looked like the thing of the future. And now he doesn't look so invincible. Now he looks like just another Republican who can't, defeat Donald Trump. So DeSantis is not, quite as strong perhaps as he would have been if he had, not run for president this year. But he's still, a successful governor. He's still someone who is very well liked by conservatives. So he's definitely got, presidential prospects in his future. He's also very young, so he's not necessarily someone who's going to fade away now. Vivek, I think, he lives in Ohio and actually would be a good pick to succeed JD Vance in that Senate seat in Ohio if Vance becomes vice president. So if the Republican ticket wins in November, if Trump and Vance go to into the executive branch, that opens up Vance's Ohio Senate seat, and the Republican governor can then appoint Vivek to that seat. And I think both Trump and Vance should support Vivek Ramaswamy for that Ohio Senate seat.
Yeah, that's because this is another thing too. Is what do you think is going to happen with the House and the Senate? I mean, this could really this is a huge factor. There's a few states in play, that could go either way. I mean, maybe Montana switches, or maybe what do you think about all that?
Yeah, so I think in the House, I'm cautiously optimistic that having Trump on the ticket is going to boost Republican turnout, just as we saw back in 2020, which was really a tough election for the Republicans given COVID and the George Floyd riots and everything else that was happening. It was a very difficult, election, and nonetheless, Republicans wound up surpassing expectations, especially in the House, in that election. And I think that that's partly because Republican voters in a lot of places where they may be complacent even in presidential years because their states are not battlegrounds, they're not swing states. Nevertheless, they will come out and vote when they see Donald Trump on the ticket just because they're very enthusiastic about Trump. If that holds true in 2024, then you could see a lot of marginal House seats wind up tilting to the Republicans, and you could see enough gains to give the Republicans real control, not just the very sort of nominal razor-thin control they have now, but an actual real Republican House coming out of 2024. The Senate looks hard to predict and very, very close. The Republicans might wind up with perhaps a 51-seat majority, but that's going to be very, very vulnerable because you can't rely upon all 51 Republican senators to be loyal and vote consistently. So the Senate, I think, is going to be kind of a stumbling block if Donald Trump becomes president again. It may also be a stumbling block if Kamala Harris becomes president, because obviously the Democrats don't seem to be in a very good position to win commanding control over the Senate. I mean, they may get in the best outcome for them, they may get a small majority or keep the small majority they already have, but that's not really enough to push through legislation. Of course, one of the real dangers here is that if the Democrats do succeed in electing Kamala Harris as president, they might try to blow up the filibuster, remove the filibuster so that they can get more legislation through the Senate and really give more carte blanche to the executive branch and to Kamala Harris in particular. Lots of dangers there, and I think that would be damaging for the rule of law in general and for good Republican deliberative practices. Republican with a small r, that is, small r Republican deliberative practices where you're meant to kind of not try to force through on a razor-thin majority radical policies that are going to create a backlash that's going to be very destabilizing for the country.
How much of a factor do you think RFK2, Jill Stein, or Chase Oliver is going to be in all this? I mean, well, RFK2 has basically said he's in favor of Trump, which has certainly created a firestorm in his own family. We're seeing, a disaffected Kennedy is now voting red. It's yeah, we never thought we'd see that, would we? But yeah.
It's pretty remarkable to see a Kennedy supporting Trump while a Cheney is supporting Harris. That certainly tells a big story that I think more journalists should pay attention to, just in terms of the symbolism for America and what it means. I think the third-party candidates typically don't have very much effect on the outcome of these elections. But to be honest, I mean, when you've got such razor-thin majorities in places like Georgia, even a small influence from a third-party candidate actually can wind up shifting that state, and then potentially, through that, affecting the outcome of the election as a whole. But in general, voters have they act out of what's called negative partisanship. So especially marginal voters who might consider voting third party, they are often voters who see one of the two major party candidates as being significantly worse than the other. And if that's true, then they're going to vote for whoever is most likely to stop that, major party candidate. So it's, a point that third party candidates often make is, don't vote for the lesser evil, vote for whoever you actually support and whoever's actually good. But if you are looking at it through the lens of negative partisanship and you're just trying to stop the very worst person from getting elected, then the argument is, well, you've got to support the lesser evil, because otherwise the greater evil is going to win, and the greater evil really is significantly greater than the lesser one. So, now RFK Jr. has tried to take his name off of ballots because he's now supporting Donald Trump. Democrats in many states, especially battleground states, are trying to stop him from doing that. They want to keep RFK Jr.'s name on the ballot in the hopes that will siphon off, a very small number of Trump voters or potential Trump voters. It seems to me that the Libertarian Party nominee is probably not going to draw significantly disproportionately away from either, the Republican or the Democrat. Chase Oliver is mostly a libertarian who's aligned with the more kind of social progressive left. And also he's a libertarian who was pretty weak when it came to COVID, as I recall. So I think, voters who are likely to vote on COVID issues, on the lockdowns, and certainly on social issues, they're not going to really entertain, Chase Oliver as a potential, candidate they might support in a way that they might have entertained previous Libertarian Party nominees. And then, obviously, the Democrats are very worried. They've never liked the Green Party, Jill Stein, Ralph Nader. It's always bugged them. They've always had the conspiracy theory that Nader cost them the 2000 election, rather, 24 years ago. So they're concerned about that. They're also concerned about Cornel West, even though he's not really getting much ballot access. Nevertheless, they fear that Cornel West would be an alternative for especially Democrats or left-wing voters who are, very outraged by the way that Biden and his administration are behaving in the Middle East. People who are very sympathetic to the Palestinians may want to vote for Cornel West, and that could come out of Kamala Harris's support. But overall, I think the third-party candidates are unlikely to, and the independent candidates are unlikely to shift the outcome of the election. They're really, people feel so strongly about Harris and Trump that they're more likely to have this negative partisanship rather than, wanting to vote for one of the third parties as a kind of symbolic protest against both majors.
While I've seen things saying that Chase, had a masked up Thanksgiving, I've never seen anything that actually said he supported any mandates. Not to mention, you've got a bunch of 70+ people, and he's 39 years old. It's. But anyway, but there is also that, Kennedy's not the only one. You have these. I know Brett Weinstein is having this, this Restore the Republic rally in Washington, D.C. And there's a lot of other people who are completely, Tulsi, who were blue 8 years ago, and now they're completely disillusioned with where the parties went. I think people who were truly in favor of free speech, oppose censorship, and maybe, we're in favor of medical freedom, the my body by choice. I've actually heard now that a lot of the, they no longer say they're pro-choice. They come out and say that they're pro-abortion just because, maybe they're going to start forcing women to have abortions. I don't know.
It's a good point. I mean, the Democrats are uncomfortable with the language of choice because it might also mean school choice. It might also mean,
Yeah.
choice in terms of. I think Donald Trump, has really appealed to libertarians effectively by talking about the right to try, which he championed, during his first administration, and during a second term, you may get even more of that, where if people want to try alternative medicines that haven't been approved by the FDA, as long as they're willing to take on the risk. I think Trump is quite willing to let them do that and doesn't want to have the federal government standing in their way. So, and the Democrats don't like any of that. They want full control. They want they want to know exactly which vaccines you're going to have. They're going to dictate which ones those are going to be, and a lot of people just say this is too much. This is now an invasion of just individuals ability to decide on their own medical treatments. And that's the funny thing, right? I mean, the Democrats have for so long said, oh, yeah, we're trying to keep the Republicans from, having a say on what's happening between you and your doctor. But in fact, the Democrats are the ones overwhelmingly, through all of their interventions in the medical system, who are trying to micromanage what's going on between patients and doctors.
No matter what happens, and looking back at the when the Berlin Wall fell, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, but nothing changed on the college campuses. Is this woke monster ever going to die, or what's? Because even though it's Harvard and Yale aren't, I don't see any signs that Harvard and Yale are going to change. Is that ever going to change, or is it just going to get worse? I mean,
yeah, I've thought about this. So there was a high tide of political correctness in the late 1980s and early 1990s. As you say, right after the Berlin Wall fell, it seemed as if American college campuses were going to be as left-wing as ever. And then there actually was a little bit of a change, and not much of a change. I shouldn't exaggerate it, but you did have a slightly less politically correct environment in the mid to late 1990s. And I think some of that may be because Democrats felt that with Bill Clinton in office, now everyone could kind of relax a little bit. That the political correctness was really aimed at the fact that Reagan and then Bush had been in the White House, and the universities saw themselves as being a kind of spearhead to discredit not just the Republican candidates and presidents, but rather to discredit everything from heterosexuality to what they call white privilege and so forth. The universities saw this as being a really important political effort of theirs. And then with Bill Clinton in office, they didn't have that sense of urgency. Once George W. Bush got into office, rather in 2000, after 2000, the universities then briefly there was a little bit of a resurgence of an anti-war mentality on the campuses. What's really interesting, though, is that once Barack Obama becomes president, the wokeness really does take off, and it becomes very virulent during the Obama years, and it continues and amplifies during the Trump years. But the fact that it happened under Obama means that it wasn't quite the same thing that was happening, 15 or 20 years earlier, when it was, it did seem to be a reaction to Republican presidents, whereas once you have a Democrat like Obama in office, there was, I think part of it was because Obama himself was the first Black president. A lot of woke progressives on college campuses thought, okay, Barack Obama is going to completely change the American system. It's going to be, we're going to get whatever kind of utopia we're imagining. And in fact, Barack Obama was mostly a conventional politician. And I think that disappointment radicalized a lot of these folks. And you saw it economically with the sudden, sort of interest that the left now took in Occupy Wall Street and in Bernie Sanders. And then you saw it also in wokeism with the intensification of identity politics under Obama, and then continuing, in the Trump years. The universities do feel embarrassed, and a lot of their donors have actually decided not to cut them checks. A lot of their alumni are in revolt over what's happened with the anti-Israel protests on campus in the course of the past year. And so even some of these Ivy League universities are starting to, you've got presidents resigning. Some of the presidents who are replacing them are in some cases even nominally conservative, or at least a little bit, more kind of moderate traditional liberals as opposed to woke ones. But a lot of this seems to be for show. It's not that the universities are fundamentally changing. It's that they realize, okay, we're getting tactically embarrassed by this. We need to retreat just a little bit in order to, fool the alumni, fool Republican legislators, and then we're going to go back to doing the same things that we've been doing for, 20 years or more. Now, that said, I think more and more Americans are becoming aware that the university system is highly politicized and is generating basically ideas that are, contrary to everything that normal Americans believe in. And as a result, there will be continual pressure on the universities. And that's the key thing: is whether or not people fall for this kind of staged partial retreat that the universities are presenting, this kind of illusion of correction, or whether the public continues to demand, wait a minute, you really do have to, get rid of all of these politically correct administrators. You have to start hiring some conservative and libertarian faculty. You can't just have, these institutions that are benefited by, millions and in fact billions of dollars of federal research grants. All of this federal loans that comes in. All of these state-sponsored colleges and universities. At the state level. All of this is coming, from the taxpayer trough. And yet the work that these universities are doing is often, aimed at harming the taxpayers, harming ordinary Americans. And that just can't be tolerated. If you're going to have these state-sponsored institutions, they really have to have, some sense of fairness at least, and some sense of commitment to the values that the public as a whole holds.
Yeah, also I've had a guy, on here named Rudyard Lynch, who's I think 23 or 24, but he's talking about this growing divide, especially under 30 among men and women, and that especially younger men are just they don't believe in they don't believe that there is an American dream anymore at all. I mean, this is the kind of these are the people who are going to be asked to fight the wars and all this other stuff. What do you think happens there? He thinks a civil war is coming.
Yeah, it's a real concern, especially along the angle that you bring up, which is if you've got young men being alienated from society, first of all, you're definitely not going to have the kind of, our all volunteer force, which is what our military is, relies on young men who are willing to sacrifice themselves for, whatever purpose the politicians send them out to die for, unfortunately. They sign up thinking they're going to serve their country, but in fact, they wind up, acting as cannon fodder for the politicians. So that's already, a problematic enough thing. But now, if you have fewer and fewer of these young men willing to sign up for these kinds of, endeavors, if they feel demonized by society as a whole, that's a kind of a long-term existential problem for a country. And, it also is going to factor into declining birth rates, unsuccessful marriages, or the rise of incels, things like that. All of this is a major social pathology. And, you've got a lot of pundits and politicians who will talk about it, but very few who take it seriously enough to say, you can't keep having, this demonization of young men and demonization of men in general, but young men in particular, and expect not to have massive social pathologies arise as a result. I don't think a civil war is in the cards. That's because, in Anglo-American history, whether we're talking about, the English Civil War or the American Civil War, civil wars are fought between competing jurisdictions, competing sovereignties. So in the English Civil War, you had competing sovereignties between the Parliament and the King. In the American Civil War, you had competing sovereignties between the federal government and the southern state governments, the Confederacy. You don't have anything quite like that today. Now, you do have friction, of course, between states like Texas and the federal government, but it's not at a level where I think it's going to lead to armies being built up and launched against one another. That said, I think you are going to see more and more, just forms of social pathology that don't take a organized, kind of military expression, that don't become a traditional civil war, but you may see, more and more, school shootings and things like that as young men, they're put on these psychotropic medications. They are subjected to all kinds of, thought control attempts in their high schools and middle schools, for that matter, and it's creating psychopaths. And it's not that these school shooters are normal to begin with. I mean, they're clearly people who were quite disturbed. But it seems to me that all the inputs that have been trying to, condition these young people, these young men almost entirely, are actually making them worse rather than making them less dangerous. And then there are lots of people who are psychologically healthy, who are not going to become school shooters, but who nonetheless are going to become just very unhappy, drop out of society. They're going to, fuel an interest in things like cults or things like, political, radical ideologies. And
Yeah.
most of that is not going to turn into violence or terrorism or anything like that, but it is just going to continue to discredit any kind of sense of, American values that everyone can, support and can actually make for a healthy and confident nation. And instead, you're going to have a nation that, is just filled with suspicion. I really think that the fear I have is not so much a civil war, but it's rather America becoming what we call a failed state, right?
Yeah.
Going down the path of a place like Mexico or South Africa or any number of other countries where, they're not in a actual shooting civil war, but they are in a condition where the rule of law has decayed. Nobody has any trust in the institutions, and you just have no idea what's going to happen from one day to the next.
Yeah, and that makes it hard to do much of anything. You said you had about an hour, and there's still one thing I've been wanting to ask you about. I don't know how much you pay attention to what's going on around the world, but I've said that often said this is the most important election in the history of the world. What do you think about the man in Argentina?
Oh, he's great. I'm a big fan of Javier Milei, and I think it's remarkable that he's been able to, make as much progress as he has in a short time, and with the conditions, that he's had to remake the politics of Argentina, very rapidly, and has had, a great deal of success in doing so. It's not that, Milei is perfect, but he doesn't have to be perfect. He just has to be a big improvement over the kinds of socialists and, sort of a big state, quasi-conservatives that you've had in the past. And I think there actually is a considerable future for a kind of libertarian populism of the sort that Milei may represent, even in the United States. It's going to have to work together with the kind of conservative and social conservative populism that you see represented certainly by JD Vance, and to a lesser extent, kind of economic protectionism that's represented by Trump. It's a difficult coalition to fit all those pieces together, but in fact, there are reasons why you see populism taking libertarian forms as well as these other either nationalist or social conservative forms. And all of it is about rejecting this kind of, establishment view that you must have centralized control that is going to be very anti-Western, and it's going to try to revolutionize our character as well as our economics. That's really the thing. The left today, and this includes, the center left, and this includes even elements of the center right that really are part of the center left. All of these elements have this, managerial mindset where they want to transform not just the economy the way the old communists wanted to do, but also people's biology with their medical programs, also people's psychology. It's just a comprehensive system of control, and populists of all kinds are rejecting it.
Well, the thing about Milei too is, he won overwhelmingly with under 30 voters. I don't know if Trump has. I don't know what the average age of a Trump voter is, but it seems like most of Trump's support is coming from, I'd say, middle-aged people.
Yeah, most of it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think Trump actually did better, especially now. Obviously, the left gets, immediately cries racism when you point this out. But Trump actually did quite well with younger white voters in, I think, even 2020, certainly in 2016. So, and of course, he's making gains. He did in 2020, and he seems to be doing even more now in 2024 with Hispanic and African American voters, especially men. So there is, this possibility for some of Trump's message to resonate with younger Americans. And it seems to me that if you do have a kind of American Milei, or someone who's able to come along and, is not as old and doesn't have quite the same, doesn't trigger people in the same way that Trump does, you could actually get a lot of this message, a lot of this anti-establishment message to resonate with an even broader swath of young Americans. Now, that said, young Americans are so heavily propagandized, so heavily indoctrinated in the schools, and they're subjected to so much, medication and conditioning. It's like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in terms of what these kids are put through, both the propaganda and also, all the attention deficit drugs and all the other drugs that are pumped into their system. You just wonder if they have enough sort of willpower or sense of their own psychological health that they can stand up and withstand the pressures that are being put on them. I really worry about that because it's one thing to be an adult and face adversity, to face a crowd that's against you and say, no, I'm going to stand on my principles, and I'm not going to simply go along with people who say 2 + 2 is 5. But if you're a child, it's a lot harder to do that. And when the left goes after these young children, as of course the whole transsexual and sort of transing children thing, that's a bad enough thing by itself, but it's also a symptom of something that's even larger, which is the conditioning of children at a very young age, and a way to kind of break down their, sort of self-respect and their ability to become self-sufficient citizens, and instead turn them into people who are so badly damaged that they depend upon and need these centralized systems, whether it's the medical establishment or whether it's the government, in order to tell them how to lead their lives. And it's that's destroying our civilization.
Well, it's also the breakdown of science in my view. But I also worry about the whole thing with helicopter parenting and just not letting kids do things anymore. I would tell any kid, watch a sitcom from the 50s or 60s, or even watch the 1976 version of the Bad News Bears. You see a society where kids were kind of at least trusted to do things, and now they're not trusted to do anything anymore.
It's been remarkable. And, that is something that I can't say is entirely, has been hyped up and generated by the left, because it's clear that, there is a generational change here where for some reason a whole generation of parents have become very paranoid about the world around them. And maybe it's because of, this whole declining trust in general. But even though America, in many respects, if you're not in the inner cities, it's quite safe. But people feel as if there's danger, there's serial killers lurking around every corner, or that people are poisoning Halloween candy and so forth, which is generally, the evidence is not really there to support that. And yet parents have internalized this so deeply that their children are now sheltered. And of course, I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with young people playing video games, but it is bad if playing video games means that you never go outside, you never get any sunshine, you never take any physical risks, you never get on a skateboard and skim your knees or whatever, you never get on a hot slide in the middle of summer. If instead you're just there constantly subjecting yourself to screen, then you may condition yourself to receive messages from screens, from who knows who else in the future, that are telling you to obey. It's like the great film They Live, where it's just these messages that are coming from all the screens telling you that obedience is demanded of you, and you start to go along with it because that's all you're used to.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate too. Nowadays, let's say a 7 or 8 year old has an accident and breaks his arm. He's going to go to the hospital, and he's going to go into a room with some social worker, and the social worker is going to interrogate him for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I mean, it wasn't like that 50 years ago. And,
it really wasn't. No, I mean, there was a degree of freedom it's weird, because we think of all the ways in which we've lost freedom to the, sort of to bigger government and, to all kinds of, coercive measures from the law. But we often don't think about the freedom that young people just don't enjoy anymore, because it's been just erased from our experience. And you're right that I mean the social workers, and there's so much bureaucracy now that envelops childhood and envelops parents. And of course this is going to be something that it's going to discourage parents from having more children too. If you have constantly have to worry about divorce, you constantly have to worry about social workers interfering with your children. All of that just subconsciously puts more and more pressure on them, saying, this is all, a difficulty that you just can't go through over and over again in your life. You can maybe do it with one child or two children, but you don't want to constantly be doing this. And so people who worry about birth rates, I think, should also worry about the, undue pressures that are put on parents through the social work system and through, all of this culture of helicopter parenting.
Yeah, there's definitely something there. Do you think it's ever going to get to a point? I mean, the red team really hasn't had a solid presidential victory since 1988. Do you think they're ever going to have one again, or is it always going to be some close race that goes down to 50-50? I mean, I don't.
It's a good question. It certainly looks as if in 2024, if Donald Trump wins, he's going to probably win without a popular majority. That's constitutionally not a problem. There is a long-term problem, and you're kind of, I think, getting at it, which is if Republicans can never win the popular vote, sooner or later, the Democrats probably are going to succeed in, using this as an issue to change our electoral system, to get rid of the Electoral College, or to do any number of reforms. I mean, there are Democrats who'd like to, get rid of the Senate for that matter, let alone the Electoral College. But obviously, that's going to be a long-term project for them. But nonetheless, a little bit of pressure is building up over time as you see these, Republican victories without having full popular majorities. I do think, however, that you can probably have changes that would bring about actual Republican, majorities. Even though he's far from a president I approve of, George W. Bush did get a majority of the popular vote in 2004, so there's that one exception in the past 30 years. It seems to me that you could have a Republican get reelected. Donald Trump in 2020 was facing COVID and riots and so many other things that completely neutralized the what had previously been a very good economy for him. If not for that, I think there was a good chance that Donald Trump, if the economic conditions and the epidemiological conditions of 2020 had not existed, instead, if you had had the conditions of 2019 in 2020, I think Donald Trump could have gotten reelected with a majority. But there clearly is a need for the red team, for Republicans, to think much more seriously about not just winning elections by the skin of their teeth, but actually going into some of the places that Democrats have control of and reducing the Democratic margins there and trying to build up more Republican support. It's ironic because I've heard it said, and I tend to believe it, that there are more Republicans in the state of California than there are in any other state. And that's simply because California is the largest state. So even though Republicans never win elections there, you have an enormous number of Republicans in that state. You just have very many more Democrats, unfortunately. It seems to me that you need institutions that are able to mobilize and organize Republicans in states like that are hopeless. Even if they can't win at the state level, you've got to do much more to keep those kinds of Republicans active and engaged, and even voting in presidential elections, even if their votes don't count, in order to have that kind of national popular majority that the Team Red ultimately needs to have. And if you're just focusing on the battleground states, then you're never going to build up to that. So it's going to be tough, but I think it is possible. I think also there is this sense that the surprising thing is that the Democrats are not more successful than they are, given the amount of media support they have, given the amount of big government that works for them, given the sort of permanent bureaucracy and administrative state that is generally on the same side as the Democrats. The universities, the education system, completely on the side of the Democrats. You would think, based on all of this, the Democrats would actually easily win every election. In fact, they don't. So that kind of backlash, wherever it's coming from, is something that Republicans should start with. They should build upon, but then they really have to, be more successful at seeming like a party that's actually addressing 21st century concerns about liberty, which a lot of Republicans are still living in the 20th century or in the year 1999 or 2000. They're still thinking about World War II. They're not thinking about the actual conditions that Americans in the 21st century are dealing with.
Yeah, I still wonder too, though, and it still amazes me that we talk about the economy, but at least Trump has to share some of the responsibility for what happened, because the coronavirus didn't do anything. It was all of these ridiculous policies, and really it started when Trump said, "Oh, I got to shut down flights from China," which was in late January. I mean, and then I think some of the blue politicians thought, "Oh, well, I can run with this," and really saw it as a chance really to destroy things. I don't know what. But
no, you're right. There was an escalation there where Trump made many mistakes himself. He also, gave carte blanche to Fauci and others within the permanent, medical bureaucracy who were willing to, make a massive power grab. Trump did not prevent them from doing that. And then, Democrats in the states, seeing what all these federal officials were doing, they went even farther and completely created, lockdowns in police states, based on fear of this flu-like virus. And then you did have, brave Republicans in various states who resisted that tide, and they were few, but they were, they did something really remarkable. I hope that Trump and other Republicans have learned a lesson from this, that they were on the wrong side by giving into hysteria, and that if this were to happen again, they should be much tougher. I don't know if that's the case, but I do think that certainly, having gone through this once, we now have at least some governors, people like DeSantis and others, who are aware of just how much power the medical establishment and the left will try to grab from these kinds of incidents, and that we need to be prepared to resist that. Like I say, I hope that Trump has learned that lesson. I don't know for sure that he has, but certainly there are Republicans now who are, trying to tell him and others in their party that you can't have these lockdowns ever again.
Yeah, I agree. What can we do to get more Thomas Masseys in the house?
It's a great question. We need more Thomas Masseys.
Yeah.
We need to clone Ron Paul and get several of him elected. I don't know. It's certainly, Massey's good cheer, I think, has been a great thing for him because he's faced, all of these attacks from every direction, every possible direction, including, there have been times when Donald Trump has denounced Massey. And Massey has always, had confidence, and he's always, had a, kind of positive outlook and personality. And I think, people see that as being a winning trait. So partly, I would say attitude is one of the things. I know it's very easy for people who are anti-establishment, whether they're libertarian or populist or nationalist, to think, the whole world is against me, and therefore I need to be bitter or dogmatic or constantly lecturing people. And Massey's never like that. Massey is firm in his principles, but he's always kind of cheerful and pretty open. And that, I think, is, if more of our folks have that kind of attitude, more of them will be successful in winning. But then also, Massey, he's a brilliant guy. He's from MIT. He is someone who has thought seriously about engineering, but also about economics, about the issues. And, so real serious study is important as well. There's a film out right now about Ronald Reagan. And one of the things I think the film fails to do is to emphasize how much self-education Reagan went through. That Reagan actually did read Ludwig von Mises. He actually did, read Friedrich Hayek. He tried to educate himself, and a lot of what he was able to do as president was based upon the intellectual formation that he gave himself. And Thomas Massey, I know, has also taken his intellectual development very seriously. So I think our people, they need to have the right kind of personality or cultivate the right kind of attitude towards the world, and they also need to have the kind of learning that will fortify their principles and give them the means to be effective if they get elected.
Yeah, well, the biggest crisis Massey's had recently was in his personal life, but with his wife dying. But it's now he's got, of course, all his, still got 4 kids, so now he's got. I'm sure that's been impacted more than anything else. But but in some ways, when you have that happen, it also makes you more. People are automatically more sympathetic to you, and it's like,
it should put things in perspective where people realize, even if they're politically critical of someone, this is still a human being. When he loses his wife, that is a tragedy for him and for his family. And it's something where, people who may not sympathize with his politics should be able to sympathize with him as someone who's bereaved and is going through grief. And so, there is a little bit of humanizing that takes place, in such tragic circumstances where people who otherwise might be pretty, politically polemical would step back and say, wait a minute, maybe I should not be such a jerk all the time because actually I'm dealing with other human beings. That applies to our side as well. There have been times when I'm as critical as anyone could possibly be of John McCain and of the McCain dynasty. But there have been times when people on my side have personally gone after either John McCain when he was still alive or even when he's been dead, or who've gone after members of his family that have just been, sort of tasteless and, counterproductive. So remembering the humanity here is a very important element for our side as well as hopefully for the other side.
For example, it'll happen on October 1st. I don't care. I'm rooting very hard for Jimmy Carter to get to his 100th birthday. Yeah. We can say we've had a 100-year-old president now. Well, I think this is a good time to wrap things up. It's been great having you on here. So yeah, you have anything else to say before we go? And where can we find you out on the net?
Yeah, so I edit Modern Age, which is a conservative journal that's been publishing quarterly since the year 1957. And we now have a website where we have daily essays and reviews. And that website is modernagejournal.com. So please check that out. You can also follow me on Twitter, or X as it's now called, where my handle is @ToryAnarchist. So Tory Anarchist, one word, no underlines or underscores. And you can find my work. I'm a syndicated columnist. I often write for, you can find my work in the New York Post and in Chronicles magazine and elsewhere. My syndicated column runs in those outlets. And I also write a monthly column for Spectator World magazine.
Yes, Tory Anarchist. Yeah, I should ask you what that name's all about. Yeah, it's a good name. So yeah, thank you, Daniel. Well, please go to buymeacoffee.com. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. I have a Substack as well. Thank you, Daniel McCarthy. I'm Chris Baker. We're out.